Stand by. Contact.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Pit Talk, pulling pits and opinions with your host, Gunny G, where service members help service members, period. Follow, like, subscribe everywhere you get your podcast and on most social media platforms. Let us know how we're doing. Any criticism is good criticism. Let's get into it. I got a special guest by the name of Kevin Maycomber. He reached out to me, and I'm super excited about this conversation we're about to have. I'll let him introduce himself and do the honors. Sir, if you could, brief background, where you from, how long you served, whether you retired 4, 8, 10, or whatever it is that you did, served,
Sure.
and operations, did you have any? No, no big deal. Duty stations, preferences, and why it was good. All floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm Kevin Maycomber. I hailed from New Jersey as a kid, and I found myself, I had a difficult family life, very difficult, and I was looking for a way out, and I actually found myself meeting with a Marine recruiter at the age of 16 years old. I was too young to get in, but I was really interested. I was really interested in what he had to say. And when I went to take my ASVAB, he wasn't available, and so the Navy recruiter took me to go take the ASVAB. I did really well, and you have to understand, I was a kid from a below average income family, and he looked at me, he said, "Son, you realize you can do anything you want in the U.S. Navy with this score." I said, "Really?" So I talked to him. I got to understand it. I understood he was a recruiter, but I convinced my mother to. So I continued my talks with the recruiter, and I mean, he opened the world to me, and I convinced my mom to sign me into the Navy 2 months after I turned 17. And I would have gone right there had I not had to finish high school. But I finished high school, and a couple weeks later, I was gone. I went to boot camp. I was still 17. I was a very, very young 17. One of the funny stories I love to say, the first time I shaved was boot camp, and that's actually the truth. I was sort of late to mature. And I'll never forget, I was standing in formation, and the DI was screaming at me, "Do you shave?" And I fucked up so bad. I said, "No, sir." And and he pulled out a Bic lighter and he flashed it under my chin. I could smell the burning hair, and he screams at me, "You do now." And so that was the beginning of my military career and growing up and learning what it was to be a man at a very young age. So I did boot camp. I did some of my preliminary schools. I did pretty well. I was a sharp kid, and I found myself my first duty station. I was assigned to a tin can. And maybe people have heard that expression, but that was the word they used to use for some of these really old Navy ships that, I mean, were basically held together with duct tape. Some of them, when I was in the early 80s, our ship was built in the Korean conflict, but there were ones that were even older. And man, you could see that these things, you questioned how well they would float, but I guess they did. And I found myself on the Mahan, and I didn't realize that the Mahan was a really, really important little guided missile destroyer. And we found ourselves out in the Middle East. And, with regards to that, I mean, we were somewhat naive at the time, I think. We had gone past, Vietnam. I write about that in my book, actually. I don't ever remember hearing that much about Vietnam. Possibly my mother kept me away from it so I wouldn't see it, but I never really saw it in the town. I think people were still naive. And then I found myself over in Beirut. I was on the Mahan from the early part of 1982. I didn't leave until after 80, well into deep part of 84. But unfortunately, I was part of the Navy that was over there off Beirut when they blew up the barracks, and they killed 241 Marines. And to this day, that still impacts me. A lot of other Marines, people talk about that, but there were dozens and dozens of other Marines killed by all types of things, by snipers, mortars. It was a really tough situation over there. And I think it was hard for us and for the American people to wrap our heads around it, because it was the beginning of what they view as the terrorism, as we call it today, was that period of time right there. They're now called Hezbollah, but at that time, it was really, I think, a Shiite movement, if that's the proper word. But that was the beginning of it. And it was a pretty scary time because, like Vietnam, there were different types of fighting approaches used there. There were different types of fighting approaches used in Beirut. It was urban warfare. That's when it really, began. So, it was a very difficult time. You saw a lot of loss over there. It was also a scary time. I mean, it was for the first time in my life I was scared. At the time, I didn't understand, but we typically, often, I wouldn't say typically, often, we were pretty darn close. We would be probably 2, 3 nautical miles away. Nautical miles are a little smaller, I think, than regular miles, or the other way around. But yeah, we were close. You could almost feel like you could touch it. And you have to put in to context, still back at that time, there were RP and there were mortars used, and we were really concerned about that. We had a reason to be concerned. Later they shared with us just so we could protect ourselves, and they were concerned that our ship was actually the target, and what they were going to do is use a motorboat, fill it with explosives, and do something similar to what they did with the hood. So we were prepared for that mentally. And it's crazy. Fast forward. A couple things have happened. One was last year I'm in a fraternity, and it's a charitable fraternity, Freemasons. And we had a guest speaker, and he was telling us about how at that same time he was an officer on one of the supply ships, and he said they were well aware that they were even thinking about using hang gliders with bombs to come out and bomb us, jump off the mountains there right beside the scene using hang gliders. Well, we just saw that happen in Israel, right? A little over a year ago. That's a pretty crazy stuff. We were scared. We were rightfully scared all the time. I mean, we went to GQ. That's the Navy's term for going to, that's your battle alert a lot. And then when you look at the reality of the rest, we didn't really know what was going on. It was a much different time. You sort of wallowed in your fear because, I saw this meme on X the other day with these kids, in full uniform looking at their cell phones. I mean, if you talk to your family, there was probably a lag time of probably about 6 weeks. You couldn't even have a rational conversation. You'd write to them, you'd mail it off. It would take 2 weeks to get to them. It'd take a couple weeks to come back to you. It's like, what the hell are you talking about? I don't even remember this. So we didn't have that information. But where we did get some of our information, it was really sketchy. It was Armed Forces Radio. And I'm aware you're going to be interviewing Mike here. I learned that Mike was responsible for putting up the tower for that Armed Forces Radio that I was listening to. And that was just like, I just learned that. I'm going, wow, it's just such a small world of how we're interconnected. I've bumped into a number of guys. I bumped into an Army guy who's a good friend, and he was jumping out of helicopters over there, and we had to miss each other by a month from where we were. I mean, so you had this going. We also faced extreme exhaustion. I think that was due to a lot of things. Crews were, smaller. We had a fraction of the technology. Everything was manual because we were an old ship. Our equipment was worn out. Everything was breaking. I can't count the number of times, like, because you're on a steam ship, right? Today they're gas turbine, I believe, but steam ship, you use the same water. They would desalinate the water, and then the crew would get one type of water, and then you would I don't know remember the process, but they would make the water really special for the steam. Well, they'd have problems with the water, so they'd take the water away from the crew and, reprocess it for the engines, of course. And we would go weeks without getting a bath. I mean, and we were working, typically 4 and 8 tours, 4 hours on, 8 hours off, 6 hours on, 6 hours off. We would do that for week after week after week without a break. And all of these things combined just wore the hell out of you. And, but I truly was scared at that time, and rightfully so. And I'll tell you, by the time by 1984, I was in my third year of service, I was done. I was already worn out because while I was in the Navy, I also had an accident. So I had all these layers of trauma that had built up, and I just didn't deal with it. And I got to my next command, and, I was trying to think about my future, but, I didn't deal with it. I masked it. And this is, the wisdom of an old guy. I'm 61. I started embracing negative behaviors, negative habits. The worst one was drinking. I did not become an alcoholic, though sometimes I question how it did not happen. I was using alcohol far beyond what would be acceptable. I mean, I was capable of every night. I'm a little guy. I'm a little bit bigger now due to my wife's cooking, but I'm still a little guy. I'm 5'6". I was
Camera
probably,
makes you look huge, so
you
we're good.
what's that?
The camera makes you look like you're, swole.
Yeah, whatever. So, I was probably 140 pounds, but I was probably drinking near 2 6-packs every Friday and Saturday night. I'd pass out Sunday, clean myself up Monday, rinse, repeat. And I was really screwing myself up with alcohol. And I don't know the impact it had on me and my life, but I'm sure it was having negative influences. But all it was masking, all the trauma I had there. And, then of course, fast forward to by the time I was 30 years old, I had a really tragic event happen. And all of a sudden, I got caught off guard and I had a mental breakdown.
Before we get there, because it's going to be good, it's just good stuff. I would transition from uniform because you did only one enlistment, correct?
I did 6 years.
Oh, you did 6 years. So you did an enlistment of
I did.
6 years. How was the transition from uniform to civilian for you with all those layers of trauma?
What transition? And so that's something
Fair
that's very
point.
different today. I think I remember some kind of exit meeting, but if that was a 30-minute meeting, I'd be surprised. And that's really what, part of my advice, because I've been blessed with the opportunity, to write my story, tell my story, but also give advice to younger people coming out of the military. And I think if the military doesn't help, transition yourself out, you are going to need to be your own project manager and transition yourself out. And my advice is, because we got none of this. When I was in an accident, I kid you not, and I don't want to go into details because it was sort of sketchy. My boss asked me, "Are you okay?" Yeah. Okay, get back to work. And sometimes because we were a small command, sometimes we had a corpsman, but that's all we had. We had literally had nothing else, suck it up, move on. And I think that was very much the military of the time, just suck it up, move on. Thank you for your service. Goodbye. And my advice would be to anybody in the service now, any active duty person listening here, or even if you are out. First of all, document what happened to you. And I don't mean in the sense like, trying to get somebody in trouble or, that I'm talking literally write your story down. What happened, where it happened, how it happened, what were the impacts. Boy, I wish I had that happen with me when I was in, because that would have made my journey a lot easier. The other thing is, I still think there's some stigma about having mental health issues, but when you get to a situation when you're on the front line, and even some other things. There's other types of traumas that happen within the military. Deal with it. Because if you don't deal with it, it's going to deal with you. And there's no shame for asking for help. In this world now, and Gunny, this is one of the greatest things you're still in. Your generation has the ability to talk about this issue and not have it come back to bite them in the ass or to damage their career. It's now looked upon that you have courage when you talk about it, but back then, absolutely not. You did not talk about these problems. It was a sign of weakness. There was a stigma to it. It would absolutely probably pigeonhole your career. It might end your career. If you were in the military, they might even push you out if they thought you had enough mental health issues, and that's no longer the case. But deal with it. And so, that's the transition you talk about. It may be there today, but I'm telling you, transition yourself. Really, really understand what you went through, because eventually you're going to have to deal with it. It's going to surface in different ways. Something's going to trigger you. Some behavior's going to arise. Something's going to happen. And you're going to have to be ready to address it, because in my case, I believe now I was alienating people because of my behaviors. I couldn't help it. I didn't understand it. We didn't
And
even have the definition of PTSD back, 30 plus years ago.
well,
But you have to get on top of it. It's okay. It's part of your life, but deal with it or it's going to deal with you.
that's really good. Transition, you say, what transition? I almost felt like you haven't transitioned from the military, but it's great. It's actually here and trying to figure out what life is after uniform. That's awesome. Yeah, sir.
Absolutely.
I tell you what. Well, that leads me to my next point. Obviously you had adversity. You're resilient because you're still in front of me today. Some of us are not resilient. Talk about that adversity from uniform to civilian and how it surfaced years later and how were you resilient or who it affected, so on and so forth.
For sure. I think a couple things happened with me. So, I'm honest about this because I talk about it. I had a mental breakdown. I've attempted suicide twice. And there were some things probably that I wish I had heard then, and I really want to share with the people listening to you that I really think could have helped that transition and helped me to move forward. And the first thing is that you learn, and I learned a lot of my mental health stuff myself. I was not getting it from the VA or other sources because I want to make point is not just because somebody's a therapist does not mean that they're trained in trauma. I did not know that. All therapists are not equal. I think there's a general mediocrity level within the therapy field. You know, it's like any other profession, the 80-20 rule. 20% of the people are doing 80% of the work and pulling the load. I think it's probably the same there. But, you know, I got really sick. And, I back then we didn't have the resources that they do today. And I was in South Carolina at that point. There was no mental health resources. I remember one of the very first therapists I went to gave me something like Zoloft or something Ativan, something really low level, and says, "Okay, you've got depression." But I went many years before I finally got to somebody who said, "You know, you've got PTSD," and I always wondered how nobody ever picked up that I had PTSD, particularly when I'm sitting there telling them all the shit I had been through, right? And so I got really sick and I wanted to kill myself. And what happened was, and this is often the case, I was working with a guy and he brought me a newspaper article. I was talking about a church that I had a support group. And I hadn't been to church in a long time. Even when I went to a church as a kid, I didn't have any faith. I didn't believe. You know, I was going there because my parents went there, and my parents probably went there because that's what you did culturally. You just went to church to be seen. You didn't go there to, you know, to connect with God. I found my faith. And when I found my faith, that was the very first step. When I began the healing process, it just stopped. It was a life altering moment that just gave me the pause to reflect. And then some things aligned after that that were near miraculous. And I write about this in my chapter, Giving. With the church, strong churches usually have outreach programs, they do missionary volunteer work. And I started doing that. And, you know, here's Kevin, he's feeling terrible about himself. But I started doing volunteer work. And I said, oh my God, you know, my life sucks, but it isn't that bad. For the first time in my life, I had perspective. And I tell this story, the most profound story ever was in a VA hospital. And I went there. I don't remember why we went there. I think it was just to entertain and so the elderly people in the nursing home portion of the VA hospital there in Columbia, South Carolina. And I was partnered up with this woman by the name of Susie. She was 96 years old, and we went there to cheer her up. And she ended up, the table was flipped, and she talked to me. I was telling her what's going on, and this woman here, 96 years old, said, "Kevin, you're a young man. You still have your whole life ahead of you." And I didn't understand how profound that was. Later, when I left and I checked out, they told me she was a World War One nurse who had who was on the front lines in World War One, so she knew what shell shock and PTSD were. That one moment is probably the most profound moment of my life. Kevin, you still have the rest of your life ahead of you. That's how I dealt with the adversity. I said, shit, my life sucks. It really did suck. I mean, it was bad. It really, I had a lot of bad things going on that happened to me because of getting sick. I wasn't doing bad things at that point. I was just a broken, sick man. But that transitioned me, and that was what planted the seed where I've spent literally the rest of my life doing for others that I saw who were down with PTSD. I started my efforts, and part of that, continuing there, I said, wow, you know, you go through all these things, and as bad as your life may seem, I said, you know, Kevin, you're a blessed man. You've been given all these skills and these experiences you can really help other veterans with. I talk about this, you know, when you look at me, I'm just a regular guy, much of an engineer, right? You know, very technical guy. I saved the life of 3 men. I have no experience. I'm not an EMT. One guy had, you know, he was right there pulling the trigger, and I stopped that. And had I not been through that, I probably wouldn't have saved their life. Now, you know, that's a hell of an honor to be able to save another man's life when you don't really know what the hell you're doing, right? So I kept having all these experiences. And probably about 15 years ago, I really got into the PTSD thing. The definition of it was coming up, and I had it, I got it. But I was also blessed in the sense, after I got out of the military, I went and got my degree. And I'm a pretty sharp guy, did really well in college. I'm well spoken, I'm well written. And you don't often see that combination with military veterans who have PTSD, right? I was able to tell people what it was like. I was standing there. And the other thing that sort of happened was, even though I was a corporate executive, I'm like, the hell with it. I don't care. I shared my mental health and it really took off. A lot of people were really impressed by the things I said, how I said it, how I related. And, I would tell the various stories of my journey. Fast forward 5 years ago, we moved here to Pennsylvania, and I found over a banker's box of notes where I journaled for 15 years. And that's another thing. I mean, I could talk for hours here, but journaling is absolutely crucial. I talked about that transition, but that's part of it. Journaling your life, what's going on. Well, I journaled for 15 years. And I've got a pretty big kitchen, and took out a pair of scissors and I would start cutting each single page into topics and mark on it the topic and stack them. I had all these piles all over the kitchen. I said, oh my God, I got a book there. And I did, and I wrote the book, and that's how I got to the book. So actually the journaling was part of that, transitioning as well, trying to understand what was going on and trying to figure out who's going to help me and how I was going to help myself.
Oh, my goodness. There's a lot to unpack there. I mean, your time is precious. Obviously, my time, your time is important to me. I appreciate your time coming on. Let me ask you something. You talk about you mentioned you had a key word there in one of your sentences, alienated because of your trauma. Can you touch just a little bit there before we go into your book? Touch on that piece. Because of the trauma you alienated. Can you give me an example how that occurred and how that played out?
Sure. So there's a couple things I want to point out to people, particularly if anybody listening here has PTSD. There's some things I wish I'd heard. First, your brain rewires itself. I don't know if you've ever heard that, but it does. When you go through enough trauma, it rewires itself. The next thing is your brain tricks you. And it is a real challenge, and it takes a lot of work and practice to understand what is real and what is not real, and what you control and what you can't control. And let me give you an example. So all of us get mad, and sometimes we react too fast and say or do something we shouldn't do because we're angry. When you have PTSD, you do that all the time. So what happens is your brain's impacted. Your amygdala, which is part of your brain, is heightened. That is where, if you've heard of the fight or flight responses, there's other ones. That's where that all comes from. And you're constantly on alert. And so you're always in this hypervigilance of trying to protect yourself. So every time you're in a situation, you see something, your amygdala goes, boom, it's that. And then you act out or you speak out. And it took a great deal of time and practice to learn how to not only manage my symptoms, but manage my responses, manage the words I used. Is that a good thing to say or a bad thing to say? Even though you think it, doesn't mean you can say it. Anger is part of your grieving process. You're angry, you went through it, and so sometimes you may take your anger out on another person, and you may not want to, but you do, but you still own that, right? There's all other kind of behaviors. You can drink too much, you can just be an asshole. A lot of people turn into assholes after they go into trauma, but it's not necessary. Well, yeah, it is. I get it. I mean, I'm around it all the time. I get it. I try to be sort of an instrument of peace right now and say, hey, have you thought about approaching it this way? And it's a whole different way. You have to really learn how to manage yourself. And I am sure I alienated a lot of people just because I was too direct. I mean, I think we all face that anyhow from the military, right? You get out of the military, there's just such a different work ethic and attitude on life. They don't I don't think know if this current world has integrity, valor. I mean, I know what those words meant. And you get out there in the civilian world and you see these people are just like, it's like, wow, is that the best you bring to the game? And you don't have a lot of patience for that. You don't have patience for a lot of the games. So, you act and say things, maybe that were okay in the military, but it's not okay in this
Yeah.
world. So there you go.
Nice. Interesting. Kevin, I'm just preemptively say we're gonna have to do round two. Because this conversation
For
is
sure.
amazing, and I'm just soaking it in. I'm sure the listeners are gonna soak it in. A wealth of experience, a wealth of knowledge, sir, comes from you, and I can tell you're genuine. I can tell, I can feel it through the screen that you're genuine about helping others. And so we got to do a round
Hmm.
two. You got to put a plug in
For
though.
sure.
How did this? You talk about journaling. You talked about how it correlates to your book. How is that? Can you give me something tangible? Two things here. Something tangible from the book. um, that people reach back to you, hey man, Sir Kevin, Mr. Maycomber, this is an amazing portion of your book. Have you got some feedback like that? Put that plug in out there with your book. And then lastly, just kind of roll on into the last thing is give a tool for the toolbox, so to speak. Somebody that's thinking about taking that 30-inch step in the wrong direction right now, and then give them that plug as well.
For sure. So this book is really unique. Most veterans write veterans books, and the book that is there today is not the one I started. So I went down, and I think it's normal for us wanting to, vets writing to vets, your experiences, and you try to relate in that fashion. And when you do a book, you need people to proofread it, and they're called beta readers. And I asked a number of people, most of them were women, to read it, and they were all saying, "Wow, that book really resonates." And then I realized, you know what? I have a chance not only to help veterans with trauma, but anybody with trauma. So I wiped out a lot of the military from it. But when you get into these books, and it's a real problem when you're looking for help, there is an ocean of these books out here. But the big but is 99.99% of them are written by academics. They're written by clinicians, those that work in the field, whether they're psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists, whatever those letters they are have behind their name, and they're all written in third person. And third person, in a literary standpoint, is you're talking about them going through it. Well, the difference with me journaling, I was talking about me going through it. And the other thing I did was very unique in my book was each chapter is a symptom that I was facing. I've never
Right.
seen that done before. You can literally go to the chapter, and a friend who's in special forces, Army Special Forces, and they're not so bright. Great guys, but they're not so bright. And he said, this guy's bright, actually. He's going to hear this. He's going to grin. He gave me the advice that, Kevin, you need to put 4 to 6 words on each one of those chapters so everybody knows what it means. And so you can go into it. So, like the chapters, I have a chapter on trusting, isolating, dying, forgetting. I have cognitive issues, helping, healing, all these things, each one. And so you can go into a chapter, and each chapter, standalone. They feed into one another. And if there's some connection, I say, okay, when you're done reading here, go back over this chapter, but they're not in order. And that was very, very different in being able to put out there what the symptoms are. And that's why people relate to it, because they say, "Oh, I have all those symptoms." And I get this all the time. The relatability on this is incredibly high. It probably explains why the book is selling as well as it is for me not being in the profession and trying to crack into it. What do you do about if you are having suicidal ideations? I was there for a long time, and I understand it. The pain is incredible. The pain is just worse than anything you can ever feel. And it just is unrelenting, and it doesn't stop. And what I realized is almost what Susie said was, Kevin, you have the rest of your life ahead of you. And as bad as you might think things are, and as difficult and as painful as the experiences are you going through, it may actually be a blessing. So I talk about that in the book. Hey, who could have ever thought that all this crap that I went through could be a blessing? And it became a blessing, because had I not gone through it, I would not have saved the life of 3 men. I would not be out here writing a book. I would not be out here telling a story and, and uplifting fellow brothers and sisters who served, who went in the combat situation and say, God, what the hell do I do? And it gives them at least some validation, a sense of purpose. That's a very powerful thing to have on your epitaph when you die. He helped his fellow man, and that's what you have to look at. Despite what you're thinking in your head, what you're experiencing, how can you turn that around? How can you reframe your thoughts and make good of all the bad that you've been through? And that's what I did.
I mean, that touched both the tool for the toolbox. You just look at the camera and say,
Yes.
you have a long life to live still. There's still a lot of
Yeah,
life ahead of you as a young man, a young woman. That's great. You're going to make me tear up, Kevin, and Marines don't cry.
that's good. Well, that shows you're a human being. That's okay. I mean, Gunny, that is one of the greatest things I think I've been gifted, is really to be able to relate. I mean, I've talked to so many veterans. I've gone to psych wards. I've been in hospitals. I've talked to disabled vets. I could talk to any of them. What are we doing here? We're giving people hope. That's all this is. We're giving people hope. There's a path forward, and you still have a chance to move mountains in your life. So,
That's good. Wow.
okay, you went through
That's good.
shit, and we're going to deal with it, but let's start moving some mountains.
That's amazing. That's good stuff. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Kevin Maycomber. Sir, where can they reach you at if they want to know more about you, reach out to you and just connect with you?
For sure. So I'm going to tell you there's a couple places. You can find me on X, where I do a lot of sort of positive motivational comments, and that's Kevin Maycomber 9 at Kevin Maycomber 9. My email is at ufts@gmail. So that's walking from the shadow info, but that's abbreviation WFTS info@gmail.com. And that would probably be the best, or they can reach out through you. And, right now, I never saw myself, I was a pretty smart guy and I had a good executive career until it didn't work, until my brain stopped working. I started having cognitive issues, for my injuries and stuff. But here I am. I transformed myself to an author, an advocate, motivational speaker, and that's really what I'm trying to do now is go out there and just share the word and some ideas on how we're going to reduce the suicide rate and make veterans' lives better. And I'm open to speaking anywhere. If it's 2 people, I'll speak. If it's 200, I'll speak. I've got some pretty big events coming up here. It doesn't matter. They're all the same. If you want the book, and this is important. So my wife and I really discussed this because the book took off. So we're leaving it on Kindle Unlimited for free forever. We're never going to charge for it. So if you're on Kindle Unlimited, you don't need to pay to read this book. The next thing is you can buy the book for $10 if I don't give you a free copy, but $10 isn't much. I just want everybody to know that all the profits are going to PTSD charities. So we chose not to take any money whatsoever from this because we just didn't think it'd be ethical to, make any money off of somebody suffering and, try to even do more good with it. My wife is a smart woman, and she was right about that.
That's
So
great.
that's that, and I look forward to being here for you again, but I am always here for anybody, and that's that. As they say, once you serve, you never leave it. It's still there. I'm still as dedicated to my fellow brothers and sisters as the day I was enlisted. That's sort of neat. You're a young guy still, but you get to my age, it's still there. It's a beautiful thing, and most people that are outside the military never experience such a relationship. It's really a good thing.
That's awesome. Thank you, sir. Appreciate your time. Thank you for your service and thank you for the
My
words of
pleasure
wisdom.
and my honor.
We got to get you on a round two because we're gonna go knee deep into my trauma. We gotta hit it. We gotta hit it hard. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is Pit Talk, pulling pits and opinions with your host Gunny G, where service members help service members. Period. Follow, like, subscribe everywhere you get your podcast and on most social media platforms. Let us know how we're doing. Any criticism is good criticism. Me and Mr. Kevin Maycomber, thank you for your service again. Thank you for your time. But ladies and gentlemen, we are out. Sir, I will talk to you later. I got to reach out. We got some follow-on things that I need for this session. So thank you for your time again.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Stand by, contact. Ceasefire. Stand by, contact. Ceasefire.
Pit Talk is a podcast featuring active service members who discuss their thoughts and opinions on various issues surrounding military life, current events, and history. The statements heard here are the opinions of its members and guests. These do not necessarily reflect the views of the Department of Defense and are not endorsed or sponsored in any way. Listener, viewer discretion advised.